This episode contains descriptions of violence and abuse that some listeners may find upsetting. Please use discretion. Hamilton, the award-winning Broadway musical, closes with a song whose lyrics suggest that among the things we cannot control in this life are who lives, who dies, and who tells your story. Adele Morales Mailer got to tell her own story in a book that she herself wrote, The Last Party, Scenes from My Life with Norman Mailer, published in 1997. This episode of A Writer's Crime will concern itself exclusively with that book and what Adele has to say about her relationship with Norman Mailer, the night that he stabbed her, and the aftermath of the event. Episode 3. Go Ask Adele. Adele's book, The Last Party, is 377 pages long, and the account of the stabbing is in Chapter 51, which begins on page 348. The chapter describing the stabbing is only 7.5 pages long. Let's begin by going straight to that chapter, to the end of the party the Mailers held on the night of November 19, 1960, when Norman Mailer was supposed to announce that he was running for mayor of New York City. This party at the Mailers, as described in previous episodes of this podcast, was hardly a carefully curated affair. Norman Mailer wanted to invite both members of what he considered the power structure, as well as people literally dragged off the streets of New York City, who were probably more interested in free food and alcohol than in Mailer's announcement that he planned to run for mayor. Adele, in her book, estimates that around 200 people went in and out of their apartment that night, and when Adele spotted her friend Louise on the arm of cartoonist Shel Silverstein, she took Louise aside and tried to have a private moment with her. The only place they found they could speak without interruption was the bathroom. Adele writes that with the bathroom door closed and locked, she burst into tears, telling her friend that she simply couldn't take being married to Norman anymore, what with their constant fighting and Norman's infidelity. Adele told Louise that she didn't know what to do. We should note that according to biographer Mary Dearborn, the woman in the bathroom with Adele was her friend Harriet Summers, but in Adele's book, she identifies this person only as her friend Louise. Peter Manso's oral biography Mailer quotes Bill Ward, the editor of the Provincetown Review, witnessing Adele disappearing into the bathroom with some girl. Ward, describing the two women as cozy, seems to be imagining that some kind of erotic encounter was taking place, and he is quoted in Manso's book as saying, "That's possibly what might have triggered Norman." By Adele's account, Norman Mailer disappeared from the party after midnight and re-entered the apartment home sometime after 4 a.m. on Sunday, November 20th. Before we read an excerpt from Adele's book about this moment, she describes Norman as wearing a bullfighter's shirt, without describing what exactly a bullfighter's shirt is. Perhaps it was a dress shirt of some kind with a frilly front. We do not know. If there was, in 1960, a men's shirt commonly known as a bullfighter's shirt, it's probable, and even likely, that Mailer was wearing it as an homage to Ernest Hemingway, one of his favorite writers. This is what Adele writes. Norman was dirty, his bullfighter's shirt as torn and bloody as his face. He had a black eye. I hardly recognized him. His face was twisted, and he was out of his head. So drunk, I don't think he knew where he was. He charged into the living room like a crazed bull, looking for anyone, anything, on which to vent his psychic pain and rage. I stared across the room at him, and for one insane moment, I became the matador, waving my red cape, hating him, taunting him, my drunken anguish and fury matching his. "Ayah, Toro, ayah," I called. "Come on, you little faggot. Where's your cojones? Did your ugly whore of a mistress cut them off, you son of a bitch? It is at that moment, in Adele's account, that Norman Mailer advances on Adele and stabs her with what she describes as a 3-inch penknife. Adele writes that once she had been stabbed, she stood still for a moment, feeling nothing, raised her hand to look at the blood on it, and then collapsed to the floor. Adele writes that while she lay prostrate on the floor, her husband kicked her and said to another partygoer, a man, "Get away from her, let the bitch die." Mailer reportedly wrestled with this man while Adele lay on the floor. Another guest at the party helped Adele downstairs, where someone called for an ambulance. Adele was taken to a hospital and spent, by her measure, 3 weeks in intensive care, where she developed pleurisy, which is an inflammation of lung tissue that makes it very painful to breathe. Adele did not press charges against her husband. She just divorced him. Most of Adele Mailer's book concerns itself with her childhood and upbringing, her ambitions as a young woman, how she met Norman Mailer and began a relationship with him, their marriage, and its ugly conclusion. The subtitle of the book, Scenes from My Life with Norman Mailer, is apt, since we are given episodes from a life as opposed to a comprehensive memoir, and once Adele and Norman divorce, once Norman makes his exit from the stage, Adele stops the story. Memory, of course, is selective. It is difficult to remember everything, or even most things, in great detail. Adele acknowledges this at the start of her book, writing that the events presented therein are recounted as she remembers them. The dialogue, she writes, where not word for word, reflects my honest recollection of what occurred at the time. This podcast, too, must be selective, choosing moments from Adele Mailer's book that relate to her relationship with Norman Mailer. I adduce that as a kind of disclaimer, that the following scenes or details do not and cannot represent the entirety of Adele's book, and certainly not the breadth and depth of Adele and Norman's marriage. In The Last Party, Adele describes herself in her young adulthood as a woman living in New York City in the 1950s with a desire to be creative, to paint. Through a mutual friend, she meets Norman Mailer, who at that time was a literary celebrity, the author of the best-selling novel The Naked and the Dead. Mailer was separated from his first wife, B. Silverman, and he was living alone in Manhattan. Adele writes that she and Norman had sex the first night they met in 1951, and that the following morning, Norman told her that he wanted her exclusively for himself. That arrangement, as it turned out, did not work both ways. A year later, Norman admitted to Adele in a letter that he had been unfaithful to her with 2 other women. In spite of this, Adele remained with Norman, and in spite of signs that part of her role was to be a surrogate or substitute for Norman's mother. At one point, Norman wanted Adele to make him scrambled eggs for breakfast exactly as his mother used to do. But when Adele failed to meet that standard, Norman dumped the eggs on the floor and ordered her to clean it up. In another episode, when Norman's mother and father are away from their apartment in Brooklyn Heights, Norman takes Adele there because he wanted to have sex with her on his mother's bed. Adele writes that she refused at first, but because Mailer was, quote, so excited by the idea, unquote, she agreed. Adele and Norman married in 1954. Adele writes that to her, a relationship was like the opera Carmen. You lived from crisis to crisis, sang love duets, and had screaming fights. I was acting out the drama of my life with a willing actor, albeit a ham, whose need for drama equaled my own. Both Adele and Norman abuse alcohol, pills, and marijuana, and their behavior among friends and with each other becomes more extreme, even histrionic, as if individually and as a couple they're afraid to be ordinary, to be boring, to be middle class. The Mailers host parties, inviting artistic and intellectual friends, even famous actors. But somehow the parties end up attracting another element of guest. At one point, when the Mailers move into a loft apartment on the east side of Manhattan, a party they give for friends is crashed by a gang of thugs. Norman accosts them, trying to get them to leave, but one of the gang members attacks Norman with a hammer. The actor Rip Torn would do the same thing at the end of Mailer's 1969 movie, Maidstone. Norman's interest in violence, in writing about it, in engaging in it, takes on a more threatening dimension in his marriage to Adele. In her book, Adele relates that when one of their new dogs, a poodle, defecates on the rug, Norman picked the dog up and threw it down the stairs, saying, "She did it on purpose, the little bitch." Adele writes that she was horrified but not surprised by Mailer doing this, and she writes that Mailer had a, quote, sadistic streak toward animals, end quote. Adele writes that prior to their marriage, Mailer had told her about a time when he strangled a kitten with a piece of string, pulling the noose tighter the more the animal struggled. Adele does not say when this episode took place in Mailer's life, if he was a child, a teenager, or if it was something he had done as an adult. Without more detail, it's impossible to determine if Mailer was telling the truth at all, or if he was just saying something to Adele to see how she would react. There is more. On the page following the incident of Mailer throwing the dog down the stairs, Adele describes how Norman, irritated with her in a petty argument, backhanded her across the face in front of a witness. On another occasion, Adele writes, "We were quarreling about something that was inconsequential, and without warning, he hit me in the stomach. I was 6 months pregnant and still recall the physical hurt and horror I felt. Thank God the baby was all right. As usual, there was no apology." Scenes like this from Adele's life with Norman Mailer are, it goes without saying, disturbing. So when we come to the point in the narrative when Norman Mailer stabs Adele, we may feel, as Adele says she did when Mailer reportedly threw the family dog down the stairs, horrified but not surprised. Not all of these episodes of violence and abuse appear in the other biographies of Norman Mailer. This leaves the reader in a position of wondering who to trust: a biographer who did not know Norman Mailer, a biographer who knew Mailer and was friends with Mailer, or Adele, who lived with Norman Mailer and alone among the people who have written books about Mailer was with Mailer when these events reportedly happened. And what about the stabbing? How does Adele view this incident that had such a profound effect on her life? How does she explain it? You're listening to the podcast A Writer's Crime, created and narrated by Tim Lemire. That's me. The musical theme of this podcast is the second movement of the Mandolin Concerto in C Major, RV 425, by Antonio Vivaldi. That piece, along with all the musical transitions in this podcast, are arranged and performed by guitarist-composer Raymond Gonzalez. You can find him online at raymondgonzalez.net. We are not even at page 10 in Adele's book when she states what she sees as the cause of Mailer's violent aggression. Adele writes that Mailer, quote, almost stabbed me to death during a psychotic break, end quote. This is an interesting term for Adele to use. It's an interesting diagnosis, because a primary characteristic of psychosis is the inability to distinguish what is real from what is not. The suggestion that Mailer, at the time he stabbed his wife, was experiencing an episode of psychosis could be taken as an argument in his defense. How could he know right from wrong if he was not conscious of what was real and what was not? Adele, who, it must be said, is neither a doctor nor a psychologist, proffers the psychotic break theory with no suggestion as to what brought on the psychosis. Psychosis can be catalyzed by any number of things: schizophrenia, major depression, extreme trauma, or even an injury to the brain. Adele is not shy about chronicling Norman Mailer's faults, excesses, abuses, and self-abuse. But when it comes to identifying exactly why he stabbed her, and if he truly knew what he was doing, she is not definitive. The portrait Adele paints of Norman Mailer is of an extroverted personality, passionate, outspoken, daring, and as many extroverted braggarts are, secretly insecure. According to Adele, Mailer told her that after the success of his first novel, The Naked and the Dead, Mailer was unsure whether people liked him because of who he was or because he was famous and successful. Adele writes that during their marriage, Norman Mailer frequently drank too much and was confrontational with both friends and strangers when he was drunk, but she doesn't call him an alcoholic. Despite the many episodes of egotistical behavior, substance abuse, infidelity, and physical abuse, Adele's portrait of her former husband is, in a way, sympathetic. Norman sounds like a stressed-out, insecure, confused man who can't seem to control himself, or who purposefully loses control of himself in the hopes of discovering something interesting, some heightened experience, to give himself something to write about. Adele speculates that Norman Mailer divorced his first wife, B. Silverman, because he was bored with her, imagining that as a young rising star in the literary world, he deserves someone more exciting, more stimulating. That is Adele's theory. By all accounts, Norman Mailer grew up being adored and even worshipped by his own family, praised for being smart, gifted, full of promise. A person in that situation may come to wonder if they truly are who their family believes they are. They might act out, be bad for a change, or, because they secretly doubt or hate themselves, want to prove that their great abilities in life extend to malfeasance as well. Such a person may find it more alluring, more exciting to be bad, no matter who it hurts. And by being bad, they might seek to uncover who truly loves them for who they are, instead of for what they do or have accomplished. None of this, of course, excuses or justifies Norman Mailer stabbing his wife, when by all accounts she presented no physical threat to him and made no verbal threat of doing him harm. The book The Last Party was not a bestseller. Adele Morales Mailer didn't get rich from writing the book, and it's reasonable to assume that her intention in writing it was not financial. If it were, she would not have waited until 1997 to tell her story. Rather, she would have written it shortly after the stabbing took place, or in the mid-1960s, at the height of Norman Mailer's literary career. As she explains at the start of the book, The Last Party grew out of a one-act, one-woman show she wrote in 1988 about her childhood and upbringing. Adele writes that Norman Mailer supported this theater project of hers. She performed it in 1990 in front of Norman Mailer and his wife at the time, Norris Church Mailer. Norman Mailer introduced Adele to contacts of his at the Actors Studio in New York, and she performed the autobiographical show there as well. In time, Adele felt either emboldened or compelled to expand the one-woman show to the experience of her marriage to Norman Mailer, which meant including the stabbing episode. This expanded version she performed again in front of Norman and Norris Mailer at their home in Brooklyn Heights. Norman Mailer even praised her when she was done. In her book, Adele writes, "Over the years, I was sick of reading about the stabbing from people who didn't know what they were talking about. It is my story, and I've decided to tell it how it was." And near the end of her book, Adele writes the following: "It took 28 years and a couple of bourbons for Norman to blurt out one sentence: 'Adele, I'm sorry I trashed your life.' It happened at our daughter Betsy's wedding in 1988 at his Brooklyn Heights apartment. I don't know why he bothered, because there was something so grudging and a little condescending in the way he said it. I looked at him, and I didn't dare feel anything, nor did I trust myself to talk about it. Besides, his timing was lousy. Yes, you did, but you trashed your life too." It was a thought that he probably never allowed himself to have. I had walked down the church aisle with Norman at my daughter's request. It was a strange feeling for me, and most likely for him. We had been strangers in the terrible time of the stabbing, and we are strangers today. It's hard to hear Mailer's attempt at an apology. He doesn't say, "I'm sorry I attacked you," or "I'm sorry I stabbed you." He says, "I'm sorry I trashed your life," at once distancing himself from the actual crime he committed, and arrogating to himself more than just the one misdeed. He didn't just stab her, he trashed her entire life. No biography of Mailer, or Adele's own memoir, indicates that Mailer ever asked for his former wife to forgive him. Neither does he say that he doesn't deserve forgiveness. It's not evident from any of the biographies that Mailer ever tried to make it up to Adele by behaving more responsibly in life, by giving up drinking, by giving up cheating on his wives. But he did, at the very least, say that he was sorry. Norman Mailer said a lot of other things, too. In a 1990 interview in Esquire magazine, Mailer said, in reference to the stabbing, "A decade's anger made me do it, and after that, I felt better." In our next episode, we'll explore more of the remarks that Norman Mailer made about the night that he stabbed his wife. You've been listening to A Writer's Crime with me, Tim Lemire. Tune in for our next episode, and thanks very much for listening.